What's up YouTube, this is Dennis Panuta for tutorials.eu. In this video you are going to learn about JSON, and not this JSON but that JSON. And JSON is going to be super important when it comes to getting data from the internet, because it's just a format that allows you to read it as a human being, but at the same time is very readable for a computer. So let's have a look at JSON, serialization, deserialization, and all of the good stuff. And by the way, if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and also the subscribe button. It really helps us out. Thanks a lot. Now let's get started. All right, so let's get started with a small presentation before we get into a practical example. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, which is an open standard file format and a data interchange format that uses human-readable text to store and transmit data objects. The power of JSON is that we can convert strings into objects in any programming language and vice versa. So convert objects to strings, which we can then send over the network or store locally to retrieve them later. A JSON object has the following format: our curly brackets that will contain the data of our JSON. Then we write down the key or the name of the variable. In this case, it's name. And then we add the colon as well as the value that we want to store inside of that key. So in this case, it's the name, and it's going to be Civ. So we have the name of Civ, and if we want to add more data, we then separate it by a comma and add the additional data. In this case, the age, which is set to 12. So in C#, this object will then translate into two properties, a name and an age. So this would be an example here. Then we convert this JSON object or string into an object that we can deal with as with any C# objects. But how do we convert JSON to C# objects and vice versa? Well, for that we use the concept of serialization and deserialization. Let's assume that we load our JSON data or received it from a server, and we managed to store it as a string. Note that the @ sign before the beginning of our string just means that our string is taken verbatim or literally, which means we will not need to add a backslash, for example, for \n or backslashes in general when we want to create a blind break. This is pretty useful when it comes to JSON strings. So instead, for example, of using a backslash where we would have to first use a escape character backslash in order to then use the backslash, we would just use one backslash. Okay, so that's what this @ verbatim does. So to convert a JSON string to a C# object, we can then use a class called Json Convert, and we use a static method called Deserialize Object, and we give it the type of class we want to convert the JSON to, which in this case is going to be dog. And we pass the JSON string that we have created. This will give us back a dog object which has the same values as the JSON string by matching the keys, so the name and age. This will give us back a player object which has the same values as the JSON string by matching the keys, in this case name and age, with the property names we have in our class. The deserialize object method uses the concept of deserialization, which is a concept in C# that will read text or a string and convert it into a C# object. The opposite of deserialization is serialization, in which C# class objects are written or serialized to text or strings, and we can use it like this. So we pass the dog object into a static method of the JSON Convert class called Serialize Object, and it will return the object in JSON format as a string. So we can then send the string to a server or store it in a file to load it later. So what about collections in JSON? Well, back to our dog class. Let's say every dog will have a bunch of toys. Since our class must match the JSON, we will be serializing and deserializing. So we can add the toys to our class as an array or a list of string. And the JSON representation can look something like this. So this JSON representation of our dog class from before and the array of dog toys will be in this format as well. So here toys, plush, bear, ball. And we start like any JSON property by writing the name of the property, which is toys, and then the value part, we will have the content of the array inside of the squared brackets here. And then the serialization and deserialization will remain the same. So when you are dealing with JSON, you are probably getting it from an API. The data you're fetching could be representing a table in a database, which means you won't be receiving a single JSON object, but a collection of JSON objects. A collection of JSON objects that can be parsed into an array of dogs will look something like this. Note how all of your JSON objects are separated by a comma, and then they're surrounded by square brackets. So now to convert this array of JSON objects, we can just parse it into an array of dogs. All right, now that you are a specialist in JSON, let's go ahead and use it in Visual Studio. Quick pause. In this video, you'll learn something about C#. And if you want to learn everything there is to know that you need for the fundamentals and to become a real C# developer, then definitely check out my C# masterclass, in which you're going to learn all of the things you need to know about C#. So you're going to learn how to do the basics, how to use object-oriented programming, how to use WPF in order to create your own user interfaces, how to use databases, how to use LINQ, how to create your own games using Unity, and a lot more. So if you want to become a real C# developer, definitely check out the link in the description below. Therefore, let's go ahead and create a new console application. And then go over to Tools, and here, New Get Package Manager, and then Manage NuGet Packages for Solution. So here we want to install the Newtonsoft solution. And I'm going to browse and not look in my installed versions. So here you see Newtonsoft JSON. That's the one that I want to make sure that I have. So here, let's apply this to my project and install the latest stable version. And then press OK. Okay, now JSON will be installed for our project and we can use it. All right. Now I don't want to just teach you how to use JSON and that's it. I want to give you the real deal. So we will fetch a JSON string from an online API and then parse it into C# objects and work with them. And for that, we will use a fake Json server and we will be sending an actual GET request to get this fake server information. So this website can help you with that. So my Json server, and it's a website that can build a fake JSON server that works like a web service that can accept REST API calls like GET, PUT, etc. So REST are the API calls that you are going to require for any kind of server-side requests. The way it works is that you will create a public repository on GitHub, then add a JSON file to it that contains the JSON data you want to simulate. Then you can access the fake JSON server using my Json server with your GitHub username and the repo name in the URL. But since this is outside the scope of this lecture, we will use a fake JSON server they have as a demo. So just click on Try Free Server. So just click on Try a Server, which you can find further down here, over there. All right, and then just go on Posts, and that's pretty much it. So you have a list of posts that have an ID as well as a title. So this means you have a collection of post objects where we have those two properties. So let's go ahead and copy this URL because we are going to use it in our project. Now let's go back to Visual Studio and create a new URL. So I'm going to create a string URL, which will be in fact this URL that we just copied. So I'm going to store it in my URL variable so that I can use it later on. Okay, so this would then of course be replaced with the URL where you get the data from. So now, since we are the client who's going to send the GET requests, we need to define a new HTTP client. All right, so let's go ahead and also create an HTTP client object here. All right, now you see that HTTP client doesn't exist in this context, so we need to add this namespace. And while we're adding namespaces, let's also make sure that we are using the Newtonsoft JSON namespace, because we're going to use its methods later on. So now we need to try and send a GET request, since there are countless reasons why this process might fail. However, we need to use a try and catch block for this. So let's go ahead and use a try and catch here. So just use try, press tab twice, and it will generate the code for you. So how does such a request look like? Well, you're using a new variable. I'm going to call this one response message. So I'm setting up the variable with the await keyword, because this is going to run asynchronously. So let's go ahead and use the HTTP client.getAsync method here, passing our URL, the one that we created earlier, like so. And here I want to use the HTTP client that we had set up ourselves, this one here. Now, as you can see from the above code, we sent our GET request using getAsync, but we added the await keyword beforehand. So this keyword here. This is because we need to await the getAsync method to finish. But at the same time, we don't want to freeze our application. But we can't wait inside a non-async method. And our main method here is not an async method. So we need to make sure that this method is going to be an async method. So let's do that. Let's make it async, but that by itself is not enough, because we also need now to return a task. So now our main method will return a task asynchronously. So for now, let's go ahead and write a message in case we get an error here, as well as make sure that we are actually returning something. All right, now because we are using static or our static main method, we need to make sure that these variables either would be static or we are just going to make them local, so that we're going to use them in the same scope as the main method. Okay, so now we don't get this error here anymore, and let's also make sure that this exception is going to have a name called E, so we actually get an object of the exception that appeared. Also, because we are using a task here, the task class, we need to make sure to also add system threading tasks up here. All right, now we're good to go. So you see, in order to get data from a URL, you need to understand async and await. And we have a video for this where I go into depth how async and await works and how you can set it up for yourself in the future as well. So check that one out. You can find the link in the description. So now let's go ahead and use this response message and actually convert it into something that we can use. So let's make it a JSON response. Let's create content out of it. So we are awaiting to load the entire page. It will be stored in the response message, which is not going to be the actual data. But now we can get the data from the content of that response message using the await method as well. So here, let's read the string from the response content using await http response message dot content and read as a string asynchronously, because this is using an await method and then stuff suddenly happens asynchronously. So we need to make sure that this doesn't block our main thread and our program will still be able to work, even though we're doing such a heavy load kind of work. All right, and now let's actually print that response onto our console. So I'm just going to use a console write line here. So now let's run the application and check it out. So you see, we get the collection of posts. So that by itself has nothing to do with JSON specifically. This is so far just to get the data from an API and use it in JSON. So now let's actually look at JSON. All right, so now you might be guessing, oh, next is Dennis is going to create a C# class with 2 properties called post, and the properties are going to be ID as well as title. Well, yeah, in my tutorials, I always aim to teach you new stuff that can make you a better developer, so we're not going to do that manually. Also, it's 2021 in the time of this recording, so let's use a robot that can create this for us. So let me show you a few tools that will come in handy if you're working with JSON in general. The first one is going to be JSON to C#. And from its name, it's a tool that takes a JSON string and creates a C# class that matches the JSON we gave it. Okay, so here we can just go ahead and use this code that we have here, put it in there, and make C# code from it. So here JSON into C#, press convert, and then it converted it and created the class for us. So this one is pretty simple, right? Nothing too fancy. Pretty simple code. We could have done it very quickly as well. We don't need to use this here for that. But now let's say we have a more complex JSON format like this one. So this is the data that you're getting. So an object has a bunch of properties. So result, for example, is also JSON object, which has an email, which has a bunch of other stuff. So it's a lot more complicated to build this manually. So let's convert it for ourselves. And you see now it created everything for us. So let me scroll out a little bit. So you see we have all of these classes that we're going to require for this particular case. So in our particular case, it was super easy, but if it's a little more complicated, then using JSON to C# is really going to help you out. So let me go back to my simple example and use that code in my project as well. All right, and by the way, you can also change the settings. So here you can use Pascal case as well as add Json Property attributes, and this will then create the code like this for you. Okay, so I'm going to rename it called post. So you see here it added the Json Property attribute called ID for it. So now let's copy that to the clipboard and go back to Visual Studio, where we're going to now create a new class. So open the Solution Explorer if you want to by going to View, Solution Explorer, and then create a new class. So add, or you can use Control-K and C, the shortcut, which will do the same thing. I'm going to call this one post.cs. And now let's paste the code in here. So here this would be, of course, post. So now for JSON property to work, you need to add using Newtonsoft JSON at the top here. So this namespace at the top will then allow you to use this JSON property. So now you might be wondering, what is this JSON property, for example, with the ID there? Well, this is an attribute that tells the JSON package we are using. The name is ID, and we want it to be matched to the JSON property ID with our posts class property ID. If you don't add this attribute, then instead we need to write our properties in the same way that they are defined in our JSON response. So here this ID uses a capital I, but here it's used with a low caps I. So if you look at the data we're getting, here we're getting a lower I, but we are actually having the property names using a capital I. So that's what this JSON property does for us. So it just says, okay, whatever we're getting as ID should be using this property here. This is useful if we want to use the property name user ID instead of ID in our code, for example, but still parse it correctly. So we could change that in our code, even though it's really recommended to use it pretty similarly. Maybe changing the capitalization, but that's it. So now let's parse and deserialize the JSON response into an array of type posts. Since we remember, we are receiving a collection of posts, not just one post. So let's go back to our program CS here and let's start deserializing. So I'm going to show you how that's done by using the Json Convert class, which comes from Newtonsoft. So the NuGet package which we added, and then you can use the deserialize object method here. So what we're saying is we are getting the JSON response, which is this one here, which was the string that we earlier brought onto the console. So this one here, and we say that this is going to be an array of posts. So deserialize that into my posts. So this will be containing an array of posts. Now let's go ahead and let's iterate through each of the objects that we have in there. So I'm going to use a for each loop here, where I go through every single post in my posts, and I'm going to use the ID as well as the title to display them onto the console. Okay, so let's run this code and see what's going to happen. And we can see the ID is 1 and the name is post 1. The ID is 2 and the post name or title is post 2, and so forth. Okay, so we're basically now getting the data and we're bringing it into a format that we can now use. So now you could go ahead and just display one information about it, for example, just the title or whatever information you want to have. So in this case, it's a quite simple example, right? But it could be a lot more complex, as we saw earlier with all of the different classes that we had here, for example, right? With all of the different properties and so forth. So now there's just one last important step that we need to do, and that is to make sure that we are actually disposing of our HTTP client. Okay, because we're opening it and we need to make sure that once we're done with the try block, we also have a finally block here and we dispose of the HTTP client here. So let's go ahead and do that. Otherwise it would stay open and that's never a good idea. Okay, so that's pretty much our code now. Let's run this and well, nothing has changed, but our program works flawlessly. Now you have seen how to use JSON, how to get the JSON data and then break it down into individual parts that you can use in C#. Okay, now one last thing, really. So there is something called codebeautify.org, which is a great website which allows you to beautify your code. So I'm going to use this code that we had earlier, which was pretty complex, right? This is JSON code. And now I can beautify it by just pressing this beautify button. And it will bring it into a format that is more readable in many cases. So you see here, there are a bunch of empty spaces and so forth. And you can basically change it. You can beautify it. You can have a tree viewer, which is pretty cool. So we have an object with 3 properties, JSON RPC, an ID, as well as a result. And this result has 10 properties. So it has an email, an ID, and so forth. And then we have a portfolio, which has 2 properties, an ETH and a BTC, so Ethereum and Bitcoin. So this Ethereum has 8 properties with all of this data. Okay, so that is something that Code Beautify can do for you. And the whole thing becomes a lot easier to handle, because what you see here is really a bunch, I'd say, and using Code Beautify is really helpful here. All right, so we learned about JSON and how to use a fake JSON server to fetch JSON data online, as well as how to parse JSON strings into C# objects or POCOs, which are plain old CLR objects. Now, there is still a lot of stuff that you might want to learn about. For example, creating a JSON server on your local host for more complex REST operations, or you might want me to dive deeper into Newtonsoft, into this JSON package, or maybe you want to learn more about async and await. In that case, you know what to do. Just leave a comment and let us know about what you are still interested in. And also, don't forget to hit that like button if you haven't done so already, and smash that subscribe button in order to not miss out on any great videos that we're publishing in the next couple of months. All right, and also check out the C# masterclass. You can find the link in the description below. And now, thanks a lot for watching the video. See you in the next one.